Hello, I'm Steph from My Driver Classic, and today I'm taking a look at a car which is recognised worldwide. It's the Citroen 2CV. Now we're filming this right at the end of 2023, and this year marks 75 years since the launch, which makes it rather incredible that a car which launched in 1948 is still so loved and cherished throughout the world, which for me marks it as that top tier classic. Now, for those of you that watch HubNut, of course, you'll probably know lots about the 2CV because Ian's driven one and owned one for, I think, several decades now. But this particular car has been borrowed from my friend James. This is a gorgeous car and I feel so privileged to be able to drive it today because it's been rebuilt after being squished at a ferry port a few years ago. And some of you may have seen it in Practical Classics. But today, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like to have a 2CV in your hands. So we're going to have a good look around the car, look under the bonnet, see how much boot space we've got, look inside, see those controls up close, and then we're going to take it out for a test drive. You've probably seen a million and one of them at car shows, but let's find out what it's like to drive. Come on, let's crack on. The story of the 2CV is an interesting one, and it didn't begin in 1948 when the car came to market or when Ian from HubNut bought Elly many years ago now. In fact, it begins in the 1930s, and it's not in a good place because Citroen wasn't in the best of health and in fact went bankrupt, which led to a takeover by Michelin, which gives the car an interesting first, but we'll talk about that more later on. Now, André Citroen, who headed up Citroen, dies in 1935, but then you get his successor, which is Pierre Jules Boulanger. Apologies for any mispronunciations. And just like Citroen, he was very much a visionary. He wanted a cheap car for the masses, a car that was later dubbed an umbrella on wheels. But it wasn't to replace a car that people were already familiar with, it was to replace the horse and cart, which was very much still a thing in 1930s France. And in comes the 1936 concept, the TPV, which stands for Tout Petit Voiture. Now, it may have been designed to be simple, cheap to produce, but France's front-wheel drive people's car was in fact engineered without compromise and to the highest precision standards. Just because it was cheap, it didn't mean they were cheaping out on the concept or the design. But here's the thing, everything's going so well, but then the Second World War happens, and Citroen knew they were onto a good thing, and they weren't about to let Hitler march in, steal their designs and further the war efforts of Nazi Germany. So they did something very brave, and they hid or destroyed all the prototype cars. And in fact, they hid them quite well, that they weren't found, some of them, for many years, but some of them have been found and they are on display throughout the world. Now, this level of deceit would have been punishable by death had the ruse been discovered, so it was an incredibly courageous act to take. Now, we get to the end of the war and finally the 2CV can come to fruition. Now, a lot of people are going to ask what 2CV means. Well, essentially it's de cheval, which in French is two horses. The two horses is the two taxable horsepower. Now, the new car from Citroen was unveiled to the general public in 1948. The 2CV's H-frame chassis lay underneath with air-style tube framework. It had bolt-on panels. It had a fabric roof. We talk about that later on, that fabric roof. But the other thing you may know or may clock is that if you look at the early concept cars, they're aluminium. But when you see the 2CV, it's steel. The reason for that is because the aluminium cost shot up enormously after the Second World War, and they just thought, oh no, we need to keep this as people's car, we'll go for steel, which is cheaper. The car was designed with independent swing arm suspension, which meant that the wheelbase on the outside of the car on the outside of the corner increased in bends, so it had astonishingly good grip. Now, I personally suspect that many of the ingenious ideas were coined or at least encouraged by, and I'm definitely going to muck up this person's name, André Lefebvre, who was in charge of the early TPV project. Now, he was an interesting man. He'd raced and designed cars for the Grand Prix. He knew what was needed for a car in terms of suspension and handling, and plus he took more than a keen interest in tyres, which is perhaps this coupled with Michelin's ownership, which led to the very first radial tyres being used on the 2CV. Now, we talked later on about the front wheel drive affording extra cabin room, but so did the interconnected suspension, which laid flat along each sill for low centre of gravity. Also low in the car was the air-cooled flat twin and 4-speed box, designed to require as few moving parts as possible, which, by the way, if you need to rebuild one of these, makes it much more of a doozy than many of its competitors. It could run for hours without overheating, and during development, test units were run for, wait for it, 50,000 miles at full throttle and used virtually no oil. You see, many cars in the 70s go wrong because they don't do much testing, but at this point, manufacturers really do put things through their paces. I know that some of you at home will be asking how big this is because some countries didn't receive the 2CV. Well, it's 3.86 metres long by 1.48 metres wide, which is roughly about 152 by 58.3 inches. Cosmetic changes were few throughout the car's lifespan, as were engine upgrades. 375cc at the start, which was later upgraded to the 602cc, which is what we've got. And that's remarkable, really, because the car was made for 42 years. So it really shows you just how right Citroen got it in the first place. And with over 3.8 million of these sold, I think that we can probably all agree that it's not only a classic, but produced in many countries around the world, an instantly recognisable symbol of France and their automotive industry. Now, testing this car today is rather special, not just because it belongs to a dear friend of mine, but because it probably shouldn't be here. The car, which is affectionately named Tupperware, is a car which you may recognise from motoring magazine Practical Classics, as it's owned by deputy editor James. A couple of years ago, James went on a breathtaking adventure throughout Europe in the car, and then at the last hurdle, he was smashed into at the ferry port whilst awaiting his ferry home, and the pictures are rather dreadful. Now, Barry, who was the star of our recent episode of Classic Heroes, painstakingly rebuilt this car with his son Pete and did, quite frankly, one of the best jobs I've ever seen in years, although it's probably a project quite close to Barry's heart because him and Pete were the previous owners of the car. Many would have scrapped the car and called time on it, but James, Barry and Pete stuck at it, and today Tupperware not only represents the interesting story of the 2CV, but of her own and second chance after such a horrible incident. Isn't it incredible to be in a car in 2023 that was designed in the 1930s to replace the horse and cart? And look, I've never actually been in a 2CV before, which is really bizarre considering some of the stuff that I've driven that's so rare and this being so commonplace. And coming inside, my first thing that I thought was, blimey, there's a lot more than I was expecting. And bear in mind, of course, this is a mid-80s example, but I do still think that it's not that far away from the original, and everything that's been put in that perhaps isn't completely as standard as Citroen would have had it has been tastefully put in. Going from left to right, you've got a parcel shelf, and James has popped a few bits on here, including some rather delicious, I'm going to show you these at home, cranberry and lime drops. They're really nice. I'm going to have to stop pinching them because there's not going to be any left, and James is going to open them on a long journey. He's going to find that we've eaten them all. He's also got a fire extinguisher, which we've talked about in videos before, is such a smart thing to have in a classic or really any vehicle, because you never know what's going to happen, you know where it is and you can reach it. So top marks for safety there, James. Coming down from there, my inner geek is coming out, I've got to tell you this. So this stereo here is actually an original to the car. And what I mean by that is when the first owner went to Citroen and bought this particular car, they paid £126 in the 1980s to have that exact stereo put in. And yes, it does still work. I'd also meant to tell you, if you noticed it, and you probably have done, by the way, that little pod box thing that's definitely more modern than the car, that has a cigar lighter implement plugged into it, it's actually running a dash cam. So we talked about James's car accident. Quite sensibly now, James has actually got a dash cam running up there now. So that'll be tracking everything today. Might use some of that footage actually in the video. Coming across from there, you've got the umbrella handbrake, just like the Ami that we tested the other week. You've got the same gear change there. And then coming in front of us, we've got quite a Spartan panel of switches and gauges. There's not too much going on, but that's one of the magical things about a 2CV is that the 2CV was intentionally designed to have as little go wrong as possible, because people were running these on a budget and they were fixing themselves, and it was a car designed for ordinary run-of-the-mill people just to keep on the road, keep going without spending too much money. So I'm not entirely surprised that we haven't got loads of technology beaming back at us. It's running from left to right. We've got the amp meter, we've got the fog lights there, you've got this gauge in the middle which just shows you your speed, you've got your gear pattern there and your fuel gauge. You've got a clock, I love a little clock in a car. And then you've got this rather modern GoPro control. James does a lot of travelling in this car, which is perhaps why it's not shiny like some of the examples that you might see on a concours stand, because James uses this car all year round, all the time, and goes on adventures. He's been to, well, all over Europe in it. He's been everywhere. But anyway, I digress, but he films a lot of it on his GoPro and the footage is just fantastic. Coming over from there, you've got your hazard warning switch, you've got your battery test switch, you've got your wipers, single speed in this. I would have liked twin speed, especially by this point in the 80s. I know that's a very small complaint to make, but we are running in a car which prides itself on its simplicity, so maybe I'm asking too much. And that is everything you've got in front of you. There's a nifty little control which I haven't shown you. I need to keep finding it. Hold on, it's just around here. Here we go. For me, it doesn't feel naturally placed here, even though it's logical. I would have put it down here. But anyway, essentially, this is a little toggle and you move it round. And a little bit like, if you've ever been in like a Defender or a Series Land Rover, you know you've got those panels that lift at the front. Well, you've got that in the 2CV as well. So you just wind that open, and that is essentially just a fresh air vent. Nice and easy. And again, without all the electrical gubbins in it, there's not really anything to go wrong. Very simple. And under here, we've got another one of these toggly wheel things. And I thought, is that for another fresh air vent? But it's not. It's actually so that you can adjust the headlights. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, the reason is when Citroen designed the 2CV, they had every end user in mind. And one of the great things about the 2CV is you can whip out these back seats in just a couple of minutes, especially once you get to know them. You can do it even faster, apparently. And the idea is that, say you're the Citroen owner, and you know, a lot of the owners were in the countryside doing countryside things, so they were taking pigs to market. So essentially what they do is they whack those back seats out, hoik a couple of pigs in the back and go down to the market. But with all that extra weight in the back, what do? Well, you move this, adjust your headlights, and away you go. Pop the seats back in and you can take the family to church, to the shops, whatever you need to do. It really is one of the most versatile vehicles that has lasted for just so long. But what is it like to drive? Well, I haven't driven it yet, so I can't actually tell you that. But let's have a listen to how it sounds. Now, if you remember when we took out that Ami the other week, it was so loud inside. I'm hoping it's not going to be as loud today. Just check we're in neutral. By the way, if you ever get in one of these, a really nifty little feature is there's an indentation on the gear stick, so you can actually see that you are in neutral without having to waggle it round, pull it out, pull it in. Do like an old Citroen. Come on, Tupperware. Now, if you remember from the Ami video, we were talking about how you really have to put your foot down in these. You can't drive them like driving Miss Daisy. So we'll give it a bit gusto, have a listen from the back, and then I think it's time we took her out on the open road. Right, come on, let's go on an adventure. Now, James has already told me off and said, Steph, you've got to keep your foot down. It's aircraft technology, as he loves telling me. And I'm like, yeah, James, but I'm not used to driving like that. And I guess that's my biggest takeaway from driving these Citroens, It's such an alien experience to what I'm used to. But here's the thing. It is such a jolly little car. I'm really enjoying it. And in many ways, I much prefer it to the Ami. And I can't even tell you for why, because it's the same engine, it's still just as loud inside, but the driving experience feels markedly different. I couldn't even put my finger on it and tell you why. I guess because I'm so used to that jelly mould shape, I don't know, it feels like a bit of a home away from home almost. Now as we cruise down this road, the car is so nimble and so quick. With everything laid out as it is, you've got a low centre of gravity, so it means that you get a bit of roll, but you still feel incredibly secure as you come round. The seating position as well is just perfect. You can see right to the end of the bonnet with ease, you can see all around you, the mirrors are well sized so that everything feels so visible, and you jump inside and just feel this immediate confidence, even though it's not exactly the same as that traditional gear change that I'm used to in the car. Now this is a wee bit quieter than the Ami, and I am wondering if that's perhaps, and you might have already spotted it or know about this, it's dynamated under the bonnet, which does remove some of that sound with that savvy sound deadening. It also adds a bit of weight, but as you can see, we're cruising along. Now as we talk about the weight of this vehicle, you'll probably know that the 2CV has something really in its favour when it comes to the weight, and that's the fact that we've got this canvas roof. Now this isn't something that someone's paid extra for or was a nice to have. It was standard in the 2CV, and all of that was down to saving the weight, keeps it as light as possible, but more importantly than that, it saves steel. And what do we do by saving steel? Well, we save on costs, so it just makes it even more cost effective, and it's just one of those really great things. Now if you know a lot about 2CVs, you'll know that there's a lot inside this car. We've talked about that suspension on the walk around, so I don't need to wax lyrical to you about that. But something I do want to tell you, because I love my geeky little facts, is that at this point, and bear in mind we talked about that prototype being developed in 1934, Michelin take over the company, I think what, in 34, 35? But Michelin didn't just take over Citroen, they did something else, and they developed what we now know as the radial tyre, which moved us away from cross plies. So the first radial tyre ever was designed for the Citroen 2CV. So that radial tyre that you would have seen as we walk round, it's the one that was designed for the 2CV. And that's quite good going, because if you think that's 1948, and there were cars in America that were still being sold into the 1980s with cross-ply tyres. So it really does show you that Citroen were well ahead of the game with the technology in this, even though it wasn't a particularly expensive car. And we talked about how that suspension's in the sills and all the rest of it. But another great thing about this car is that it was front-wheel drive, which was a really big thing for the 1940s. People were still suspicious in the 1960s about it in Great Britain. And what comes with front-wheel drive? Well, you've not got all the transmission tunnel down here. So it means that inside this cabin in here, we get so much more space than you might get in something of an equivalent size that's rear-wheel drive in that more traditional sense. Now as we come along, I'm going to be a little bit weak here and tell you that there's not much that I can find to actually criticise about this car. I'm really enjoying it, and every time I've seen pictures of James's travels across Europe, I will admit something, and it's a really deep, dark confession. I've looked at it and thought, James, how on earth have you driven that 2CV so far? It just doesn't look that comfortable. I take it all back. These seats are so comfy. This suspension, as we just casually bounce along the road, it's so comfortable and comforting. You know, a little bit like that Ami, it is very loud inside here, but a little bit like I was with the Morris Minor at first, and I always used to think that was so loud. You quickly become accustomed to your surroundings, and it goes from being what can feel offensively loud, especially if you've not been in an old car for a while, to something that just becomes background noise. Even though we can hear a lot of wind rushing around our heads. So what do we end on? What would we change? Well, I'd like it to be a bit quieter, and I know that perhaps that's not something that we can do. I'd maybe like a 2-speed wiper, but apart from that, I come away from my 2CV experience thinking, blimey, actually, I don't think I'd change anything. And weirdly, it feels so much more modern than the Morris Minor to drive. That can feel a little bit tinny at times. I've really enjoyed this in a way that I didn't expect to. I thought that I was going to find it almost like a poor man's substitute for my beloved Morris Minor. But in fact, I've really enjoyed this. If you ever get the chance to drive one, you definitely should. You'll be able to see the hype straight away. It is just such good fun. It's put a smile on my face that I wasn't expecting to have today. So I was rather grumpy because it's quite cold outside and I'm quite tired. But no, James has said to me for a long time, the minute you get in my 2CV, he said you're going to change your mind and you're going to really enjoy it. And James, you were absolutely correct. This has been such a jolly experience. Now I know that a lot of you out there have 2CVs. I would love to hear your experiences. So leave me some stories in the comments section below. I look forward to reading them. And I also look forward to selecting second gear at first attempt. But until next Sunday, when we're looking at something completely different, take care and drive safely.